good morning everybody. It's an absolute pleasure to be back in Epping Forest and just to be reminded of what a very special place this is. There was a train strike today, so I finished up driving down from Cambridge, came through the forest to come down here and just struck by this incredible landscape compared to what you drive through the chalk hills of South Cambridgeshire, the very intense agricultural fields of parts of Essex, and then coming to this incredible gem that is still there in the form of this ancient wood pasture with its tens of thousands of ancient trees set amid a breathtaking landscape. And one, I guess, is invited to think, why is it still there? Because so much of England used to look like that. Incredible wild spaces filled with wildlife, with thriving local economies dependent upon those ecosystems, and yet over time, of course, we've removed the vast majority of them. And actually just coming through here and seeing that place still intact and thinking back not so long ago to the mid-Victorian era, and quite a lot of the country still would have been in that kind of ancient landscape condition. Epping Forest was lost in the 1850s, quite near to here, cleared to make way for urbanisation and for agriculture. Whittlesea Mere, near to where I live in Cambridgeshire, was the largest lowland lake in England. It was drained in the space of a single year when steam-powered water pumps were deployed there to drain the land for agriculture. And across the decades, you can just see this great litany of losses that has occurred as the demands of a growing economy, more and more demanding society, have taken their toll, taking more land, changing the character of the environment, in very many cases reducing the quality of the environment too in terms of air and water purity, leading to these really quite drastic declines in wildlife that have been documented now in different ways in this country, probably more closely than anywhere else on earth. We know about songbird populations over very long periods, we know about the losses of wildflower meadows and so on and so forth. And yet, there are a few places like Epping Forest that are still there. Now, if you look back as to why that is the case, I mean, this place, like so much of England, has an incredibly rich history from being a royal hunting estate, but then later on being protected, including under legislation that was first enacted in 1949, the National Parks and Access to the Countryside Act. That founding legislation that was enacted in the smouldering ruins of the Second World War actually was conceived in the depths of that conflict. In 1941, 1942, experts were meeting in a special committee to consider the future of the country in the post-war years. And the visionary leaders back then, who were thinking of what Britain could be like after that terrible conflict, they said one thing we need to do is to protect the beauty and the richness of this country's environment. They didn't call it the environment in those days, they called it the countryside, and they talked about wildlife. But nonetheless, through that legislation, more than 70 years ago, they put in place the building blocks for the national parks, which now cover a large area of this country, the areas of outstanding natural beauty, and significantly for the work that we do to conserve wildlife, the sites of special scientific interest. And also in that legislation were the national nature reserves, and on top of all of that, national trails. And so what you had in 1949 is this attempt, through law, but based on vision born out of a terrible conflict, to create a new future for the landscape, to protect those beautiful places and to make them accessible to people, and to protect the biodiverse places, a word that we use now, biodiversity, the nature, in order to ensure that our native animals and plants didn't disappear. And so those steps actually have been pretty critical in enabling us to hang on to what we still have, which is much depleted, but actually we have an awful lot more today than we would have done had those Acts of Parliament not been put in place. And of course, Epping Forest has got a particularly unique history, and it was even 70 years before the 1949 Act that this place was protected, including for enabling public access. And so we look to the modern world and the place we're in today, and what was being put forward in those post-war years in terms of environmental nature protections, which have subsequently been added to by all sorts of additional laws for air and water protection, and also, of course, through codes that were introduced as a result of our membership of the European Union, and indeed various codes that were enacted by the European Union on the advice and leadership of the United Kingdom, including the Habitats Directive, which is a piece of law which protects species and habitats of European importance, and of course applies to much of Epping Forest. 2,400 hectares of the place is site of special scientific interest. About 1,600 is a special area for conservation, so that additional European protection on top for bats, for the incredible ancient trees. This is one of the biggest areas of wood pasture in Europe. I think even competing with some of the large landscapes that remain intact in Romania. So it was seen as of importance at a European level. So all of those protections have been accumulated around these special qualities. Now the thing is that in the modern world, even compared to the 1990s when some of that European law was coming forward, we've now entered a different phase. We now know that the attempts we made to draw lines on maps to protect particular special places is no longer enough. Why is it no longer enough? Well, we realise that we have these additional, much bigger pressures now coming on top of the environmental issues that were there a few decades ago, including climate change, of course. When I was working at Friends of the Earth during the 1990s, when the scientific community began to raise ever more urgent warnings about what was going on in terms of the changes to the composition of the Earth's atmosphere and what this would mean for basic conditions in terms of seasonal patterns, extreme weather, all of the things that you can see in your TV screens day in, day out now actually were not on the agenda even until quite recently. So looking at how we conserve and how we go forward in the context of that is critically important. We've also discovered that nature is essential for human health and well-being. I'm sure all of you have an enormous interest in the wildlife that lives in Epping Forest, but my guess would be actually it's at a much deeper level that you feel the benefits of connecting with that incredibly beautiful and wild place. And we now know, as a result of endless research now being done by social psychologists and scientists looking at human behaviour, that the health and well-being benefits we get from access to places like that, they are absolutely huge. And you can start to even put some monetary figures on those in terms of avoided costs for the National Health Service as a result of people being more active because they're outside, or as a result of them having psychological well-being through that connection with the natural world. And indeed at Natural England we did a piece of work a few years ago to reveal how £1 invested in access to green space will give you, this is near to a town, will give you £7 benefit in avoided costs of the National Health Service. Antidepressant drugs, anxiety, the challenges that come with inactivity, these things can at least be reduced if we can provide access to these beautiful spaces. And again, you know, that was partly there in the 1949 Act, but not so explicit as the science would have us believe today. And then, of course, we have big questions of water and food security, both of which have been on the agenda this year. Big drought, war in Ukraine, and again, in the modern context, the environment, as we used to call it, really is the source of both of those. All of our fresh water is coming out of the natural world, starting with clouds, getting into aquifers, bubbling through in springs that fill rivers that we then abstract, which we put into the drinking water supply. There's no separation between our dependence on clean water and the health of the natural environment. These two things are the same. And so it goes for our food security. Sometimes you hear people say, well, you know, we don't need to be focusing so much now on these environmental priorities. What we should be doing now instead is be focusing on food production and food security. As if food came out of a plastic bag. It doesn't, ladies and gentlemen. It comes out of healthy soils, and it depends upon pollinating insects. And we get huge benefits from natural pest control, and most of all, as we saw in East Anglia this year where I live, big issues linked with climate stability. If the ground is rock hard and you have 40 degrees centigrade temperatures, vegetables don't grow. The two things are utterly linked together. And so this is the context for conservation in the modern world. We need to go beyond where we were in the 1940s up until the 1990s, where we were protecting particular places. Vital although that was, we now need to go to the next stage and shift our mindset to, yes, embrace conservation, but to now also additionally bring in the idea of nature recovery. Slightly different connotations. For conservation, and I spent a lot of my time at Friends of the Earth over the years, we were fighting for the protection of little bits of remaining good quality habitats where rare animals still lived, rare plants still thrived. We've got to protect them. Yes, we still have to do that. But now we've moved into a new phase where we're not only saying protect what's left, we're saying rebuild, restore, start to put back a lot of what has gone. And we know we need to do this for some very good evidence-based reasons. Now, reason number one, which is an ecological reason, is because the way in which we have deployed the tools of sites of special scientific interest, national nature reserves, local nature reserves over the years. What we've finished up with is a collection of little places. You can look at them on the map. Isolated little fragments of woodland here, of wetland there, a nice grassland over here, all incredibly beautiful places. But we know that if we're going to meet our targets, and we now have official, legally binding targets in this country, to halt and reverse the loss of wildlife, if we're going to do that, then these little isolated patches aren't going to do it. Now, there was a very important review published in 2010, led by one of our leading scientists, Sir John Loughton, who conducted a review that was in the end called Making Space for Nature. And what he was asked to do by the government of the day was to see what was needed to stop this continuing decline of the quality of our natural environment. And to cut a long story short, he said, yes, these little places we've got are vitally important, but we need more of them. They need to be bigger, they need to be in better shape, and crucially, they need to be connected with one another. So that idea of more, bigger, better connected moved centre stage. Now, at the same time as that was happening, and in parallel to that, other scientists were starting to examine exactly what I talked about a moment ago, in terms of those practical values that the country gets from the natural world, for public health, for food security, for the purity of our rivers, and also for catching vast amounts of carbon, including in those ancient trees up there, and also being able to deal with the effects of climate change. You know, do you know what one of the best things you can do in a city that's going to be facing 40-degree heat waves into the future? The single best thing you can do is plant loads of deciduous trees. And amazingly, they adapt with the seasons. And so when you've got blazing heat coming through your windows, the leaves shade the light out and cool your buildings down. And then in the winter, when you need more daylight, magically the leaves all fall off. And you get this incredible ecosystem service throughout the year, making the place cooler, more pleasant, more beautiful, at the same time as adapting to climate change. So all of these factors are coming in at the same time as we are realising that we need to rebuild the connectivity and the scale of nature-rich areas in the country. And so this idea of nature recovery, then, I think becomes one about multiple things that we have to do at once. So what do we have to do? We have to stop the animals and plants going extinct. We've got a good body of evidence and solid scientific work going back decades to know how to do this, and this is really at the core of Natural England's work. Also, we look after the national parks and the areas of outstanding natural beauty in terms of declaring those and working with the people who run them. So there's a beauty and access element there too. Those two things go very well together. And then a third element, which is now very strongly on the table, is this question of how we protect and increase those practical benefits in the natural world. So the carbon, the flood reduction, the food security, and rebuilding all of those benefits we get. And then on top of that, in terms of nature recovery, the other piece that we have to blend in is the historic environment. I've travelled quite a lot in my role in Natural England since coming in a few years ago. And one of the things that struck me as being bizarre to the point of almost being ridiculous, was various fights going on across the country between those people who were trying to protect the historic heritage and those people who were trying to protect the wildlife. When in fact, again, it's another one of those things you think these two are so strongly overlapping that there should be really strong common cause there. And of course, in this landscape here, you cannot separate the historic and cultural dimensions from the nature and the landscape, and indeed the carbon dimensions. So having this integrated view of how we bring all of these things together is, at Natural England, what we mean by nature recovery. It's about looking at a large scale, being able to look at all the benefits that are in the landscape, and then to be working with multiple partners to be able to realise all of those benefits by getting people to work together in common cause. Easier said than done. To frame our mission at Natural England these days, we talk about building partnerships for nature's recovery, to do all of these things in a way where we can get everybody more or less cooperating at scale. And the vehicle that we are using to do this is a so-called Nature Recovery Network. So this is John Loughton's thing I told you about a moment ago. More, bigger, better connected, and doing that in a way which realises multiple benefits. And the idea of the Nature Recovery Network is actually a piece of government policy. It's included in the 2018 25-year Environment Plan, a critically important document launched by the Prime Minister in January 2018, and is the vehicle upon which much of Natural England's work now travels. And the Nature Recovery Network was in there with a figure on it. It said we need to have 500,000 hectares of new habitat by the end of this period, and that's in addition to what we've already got in the protected areas. Now, we think at Natural England, 500,000, yes, that's good. We think probably we could do 750 or even more than that, or 1 million hectares. But just to give you a sense of the scale, the site of special scientific interest here, as I understand it, is 2,400 hectares. And so that government target is 500,000 hectares. That's not tiny. And at the same time as that work has been developing at Natural England and working out how to build that nature recovery network, we've had additional targets and commitments that have been made, including by Prime Ministers. So Boris Johnson, Prime Minister, went to the United Nations General Assembly in New York in September 2030, and he came back having signed the Leaders' Pledge on Nature. And the Leaders' Pledge on Nature said a number of things about recovering the health of the natural world, including the target of having 30% of the country in the conservation of nature, land and sea, by 2030. So that's already 2 years gone, we've got 8 years left, we've got to get on with this. And I was delighted to see the other day a repetition of this target by DEFRA, the government department leading on these subjects, who in the wake of a level of concern, let's say, raised by the Royal Society for the Protection of Birds, the Wildlife Trust, the National Trust, in the wake of the growth plan, they said, yes, that target stands, 30% by 2030. That target is made on the global stage in the context of negotiations that will take place in Canada next month, where we're hoping that there will be a coming together of the global community for countries across the world to adopt that same target, 30% protected by 2030. And actually, anyone listening to the radio this week, you may have heard a clip about that target having been officially adopted in Australia and coupled to a goal to end extinctions in that part of the world, that country being probably the capital for mammal extinctions over recent centuries. And so Australia, amongst those countries that's now stepping up alongside the lead that we showed a couple of years ago. So these are big targets, and then in the Environment Act, passed November 2021, at Natural England, we were delighted to see a legally binding target, which now sits there alongside our net zero target, which is also legally binding, which says that we will halt the decline of nature by 2030. So this is really, really big stuff that's been put on the table over successive administrations, and which now is the platform upon which Natural England is operating in order to look forward to the future of our work. Now, in terms of delivering all of this is of course where the rubber hits the road. You can make the targets, but you've got to have some way of actually doing them on the ground. Fortunately, we do have some tools that are going to help do this. Probably the single biggest thing, and this has been in the news a little bit lately, is the new post-European Union agricultural policy, the so-called Environmental Land Management Scheme. So, as members of the European Union, we paid our farmers, for the most part, based upon how much land they had. If they had 100 hectares, they'd get a certain amount of money. If they had 1,000 hectares, they'd get 10 times that amount of money. The bigger your land holding, the more you got, and it wasn't a very equitable system, wasn't linked to any particular environmental outcomes. Some of the budget was being spent on so-called agri-environment schemes, like countryside stewardship, which still operate and which we have a big role in at Natural England. And that money, however, was still largely going to these so-called area payments. Now, what's happened since we departed the European Union is a lot of work on this new farming scheme. And that really is a game changer. Because if you shift that budget from simply the amount of land you've got, and instead into how much you've recovered the wildlife, is your soil and hedgerows taking up carbon, is your farming method leading to the rivers becoming cleaner and reducing flood risk downstream? Is it open to the public? Are you conserving the historic environment? Then you get paid for all of that. And actually, a great many farmers across the country that we've been speaking to and working with, they welcome this shift and are looking forward to being able to work with it. And there are 3 schemes that government's been talking about to enable this transition from area payments into so-called payments for public goods. And public goods is a term used by economists. It means things you can't buy in the shop. So payments for a public good would be things like carbon capture, clean air, clean rivers. You can't buy those in the shop. You can buy food in the shop, however, meaning that in the parlance of economists, this is a separation in terms of the economic benefits you're getting. And so the money being lined up to pay for those things that are not in the market is the direction of travel, and some of it's very, very exciting. Last month, government announced a series of so-called landscape recovery pilots. So these are very large area, multi-partner initiatives. 1 or 2 I've been to visit across the country, including one on the North Norfolk coast. And if anyone knows North Norfolk, an incredibly beautiful part of the country with a series of national nature reserves scattered along it. And the landscape recovery pilot will be seeking to reconnect all of that amazing wetland, dune and grassland habitat all the way from Hunstanton across to Sheringham, across that entire coast. This is the kind of vision, building on the work of Sir John Loughton, that is now possible to start taking forward using that new policy tool. It's incredibly exciting, and much to be said about this landscape and the extent to which that kind of thinking in the future can be deployed here using these new tools. So the environmental land management, big tick for that in terms of driving forwards on those big targets that government has set. On top of that, we have a new tool called biodiversity net gain. A lot of discussion, let's say, going on across the country around the merits of new housing developments, especially near to established communities in beautiful parts of the country that fear as though their environmental policy is going to decline as a result of new housing coming in. This needs to be done extremely carefully, thinking about master planning, infrastructure, pressure on services, all of these things. But one thing we certainly need to be thinking about is the impact on nature and biodiversity from these new houses that will be built. And so the biodiversity net gain policy, which will become law next year, basically will require developers who are going to put up some houses to measure the nature in the place where they're going to put the houses, and then for them to organise the recovery of that amount of nature plus 10% somewhere else, possibly nearby, possibly a little further away. Those details are still being worked through by government. But the point is that in the future, infrastructure and housing, so HS2, would it be approved today, would have to comply with this policy. New housing, commercial property, they're going to have to be buying nature benefits from someone else. Now, this is a huge opportunity for people who are managing land. I'm going to meet some farmers next week in Norfolk who are restoring wetlands already in order to be able to sell those nature benefits to housing developers in the future. It's a pioneering tool in this country. We've not seen anything like this before. Raises quite a lot of concerns with different people who think, well, is this just going to be a way of licensing the trashing of nature in order to accommodate housing? We've been working very hard to ensure it isn't that, although, as you will have been seeing in the news during recent weeks, big discussions now about to take place about the future of the planning system, including in these so-called investment zones. Having said that, that tool is there, biodiversity net gain. And then, of course, alongside these new tools, and there are others in terms of carbon payments for peatland recovery, there's another one that we're working on now, which is about catching nutrients from new housing development to protect rivers and wetlands. That's going to be coming live fairly soon, plus the existing protected areas, the SSIs, the National Nature Reserves, plus the work that the voluntary groups are doing, the Wildlife Trust and everyone else. And you can begin to see that actually that nature recovery journey going into the future, we've got some big targets, we've got some tools coming available, and we've got quite a lot of people who are already quite interested in this. And that group that's quite interested is growing. Not only housing developers actually from the private sector, also water companies. I was in a discussion the other day with Severn Trent Water, who are trying to increase the amount of water they can supply to the public. They're abstracting from the River Trent. The River Trent is full of pesticides, it's full of pollution, it's pretty unpleasant. It costs a fortune to clean that water up, to get it into a good state for the public. Do you know what Severn Trent have done? Instead of spending millions of pounds on an energy-intensive, chemical-intensive technology, they've built an enormous wetland. They're diverting the river through the wetland, and they're using that to be able to catch a lot of the pollution before it goes for final treatment and then into public supply. They're saving money, they're cleaning up the water, and they're creating an amazing wildlife habitat. So the number of partners that we can bring into this programme of nature recovery is gradually growing. But it's not only the usual suspects, it now includes some of the big private sector actors, including housing, including water, and of course including farming, because many of the most enthusiastic fellow travellers on this journey at the moment are different groups of farmers who are investing in regenerative methods and working together at landscape scale to do that. So, what does all of this mean for the Epping Forest landscape? And where does your particular jewel sit in this crown of nature recovery that the country is now embarking upon? And so I just think maybe back to some of those points a moment ago about connectivity and scale and being able to create bigger and better and more. And also, at the same time, to be thinking about some of the existing pressures here and some of the questions of wider environmental quality. So air pollution, I know, is one of the major factors here in terms of nitrogen deposition, as I understand it, mostly coming from the transport side, and that now is a candidate case for Natural England in so-called shared nitrogen action plans that we're putting together, so-called SNAPs. We're looking at the Epping Forest region as one place where we might start to build up that discussion with the local authority to be thinking through how tricky and complicated subjects like traffic management might be brought into a better place to protect the quality of this internationally important wood pasture that's right here. On top of that, of course, is the pressure of visitors. I don't know what the numbers were like here during COVID-19, but the nature reserves around us in Cambridge, they suddenly had 3, 4, 5 times as many people visiting them. And that, of course, is to be welcomed, recognising those huge health and well-being benefits that people get from access to places like that. But how do we manage it? How do we make sure that that visitor pressure is not going to detract from the overall quality of these wonderful places? And so that's about management plans, it's about, again, partnerships, about public awareness, and all of these things that we know about. Looking to the future, however, and you know, I had a quick view on Google Earth Maps last night just to remind myself of the extent of Epping Forest. I mean, this place is unique in so many ways, but one of the things which is really very important about it is the size of it. It's got a few roads and things cutting it up here and there, but an area of woodland, never mind ancient wood pasture, like that, that is very unusual in England, especially in the south, and especially on the edge of our capital city. And actually the value of places like that, there's very beautiful places in the Scottish Highlands which are ancient woodlands. I'm just reminded actually of a piece of work done by the Natural Capital Committee a few years ago, government advisory group, looking at the value of nature to the economy. And they said probably the biggest value we've got from healthy nature is the cultural value, including the health value. And they said, if you look at an area of woodland, and they modelled it with their economic numbers, and they put this area of woodland in a remote part of the country, and it was worth so much, and then they, in their model, they put the area of woodland next to a city, and its value went up tenfold, because the main value was about health and well-being. So this huge, intact landscape is sitting at the edge of our capital city. It could not be more valuable, it could not be more important. But thinking to the future, yes, we've got to do something about the air pollution. Yes, we've got to do something about the visitor pressures. And crucially, even though it's already big, we've got to make it bigger, I would say. And to be able to extend those green fingers that could come out of the forest into the wider landscape. This is what Sir John Loughton said we need to do. And increasingly, there are willing partners to work with us on that job of reconnecting and expanding. Wildlife trusts, various farmers. I know that the City of London Corporation owns some land that's already adjacent to the forest. Over time, might it be possible to get some more? Well, it probably will be. Heritage Lottery Fund, who knows? But I think if the vision is there to say that this place is incredible, but actually it could be more incredible still. It could be even more valuable for London, the country, and indeed the world, because it's globally important. We're going to make this place considerably larger, and in so doing, we're going to be able to absorb more visitors. We're going to make the place more resilient to climate change impacts. We're going to reconnect it into the landscape, maybe up the Lee Valley, who knows, maybe one day even connecting with Hatfield Forest, another fragment of ancient wood pasture in this part of the country. That kind of vision, I think, would bring a lot of people with a lot of energy to want to work together to realise all these benefits that we can get for the country from nature recovery. Now, just one final thought I just leave you with, and that is a conversation arose when I was here a year ago with the City of London Corporation. We started talking about whether Epping Forest should be a national nature reserve. Now, we've got 200 of these, more or less, 220 across England. These are the very best places. These are the places where, really, the crown of nature, these are the big jewels. And they are increasingly, at Natural England, turning out to be at the centre of our ambitions for that nature recovery network I talked about. I mentioned North Norfolk and the landscape recovery pilot there that's going to potentially link up a series of national nature reserves across the North Norfolk coast to fill in the gaps between them to create one of the largest scale areas of high quality habitat creation in England that may occur into the near future. And we are very excited about that, not least because we've done this now twice already with the existing national nature reserves. In 2020 we declared the so-called Purbeck Heaths Super National Nature Reserve. So that legislation, enacted in 1949, led to 3 wonderful national nature reserves being declared on the Isle of Purbeck. Studland Heath, Godlington Heath, and another one whose name I can't remember. And these places were declared during the 1950s because of this incredible heathland wildlife. Sand lizards, Dartford warblers, nightjars, smooth snakes, an incredible array of wildlife. And it was being gardened by the Natural England teams to make sure the habitats remained. And then a few years ago, some of our people, after about 20 years of work, they thought, why don't we put these 3 together? Instead of having 1, 2, 3, why don't we have one great big one? And so working with the Forestry Commission, the Dorset Wildlife Trust, working with private estates, the Royal Society for Protection of Birds, the National Trust, in 2020 we declared that new super National Nature Reserve. 3,100 hectares, so even bigger than Epping Forest. And if ever you go to Dorset, I thoroughly recommend you take a walk around there. And over the coming years, that place is going to be incredible. Because now, instead of gardening it, we're we're able to let natural processes start taking over, putting some traditional cattle back in there, some wild pigs, and crucially beavers, to be able to create wetlands and to re-establish that mosaic of habitats in which the nature thrives. So we did that one. And then we did another one in Somerset, the Somerset wetlands. We declared that one earlier this year to mark the 70th anniversary in 1952, when the first national nature reserves were declared. Those were when the first ones were actually put onto the map after the 1949 legislation. And that place is bigger still, 6,000 hectares, so 60 square kilometres, that one. And it's a mosaic derived from 6 existing national nature reserves, plus some new pieces belonging to the Wildfowl and Wetlands Trust, the Somerset Wildlife Trust, and others, to be able to create this huge new national nature reserve. And so I wonder, looking over the horizon, maybe for the next 70 years, and what this part of England would look like, whether a national nature reserve here might be a good idea. Not because the place is not protected, it is protected and it's beautiful. But a national nature reserve could enable that kind of longer-term vision about expanding back into the landscape, to be bringing in parts of the land which could now help to meet modern challenges, climate resilience, public health and well-being, dealing with environmental quality. So that's the question. It's up to various people thinking through the options for the landscape, but whichever way that goes, I have to say that the work that's been done here over a very long period is incredibly impressive. The country should be very grateful for everyone who's putting in the effort to keep Epping Forest in the incredible state that it's in. My colleagues at Natural England are looking forward to working with the various entities who are active here to go forward into the future, to do the best we can with you to keep that place as it is, but actually even to make it better. Thank you very much indeed.
Saturday morning in Loughton, thank you very much. So if I'd like to invite our chair, Judith Adams, up to the stage, and Paul Thomson, the Superintendent of Epping Forest, and we will just briefly introduce them, and then we'll open up to the floor for questions. Who is not going to be shy and ask the first question to our distinguished panel? So we've got a lady at the back. And
Thank you. I applaud everything you've said, and I hope we continue in that way. Sadly, what I've heard the new government say is undermining everything. Will you convince me that I'm wrong?
Very good question, and I think the only people that you can find to credibly convince you that you're wrong probably is the government. And I think probably there are 3 major headings that we need reassurance on, and one of them I mentioned already is the agricultural policy. There is a review of agricultural incentives and the measures to promote farm productivity going on. That was announced in that growth plan that came out 2 weeks ago, yesterday was it, with the Chancellor setting out the headings for growth in the country. And we will advise government that if there is going to be a prospect of meeting those 2030 targets, then that policy has to remain focused on nature recovery and not go back to where it was under the European Union and be a vehicle for area payments. That is what we will say. On the so-called investment zones, this has led to a lot of concern amongst local communities and environmental groups about the extent to which the suspension of the existing planning regime to accommodate more rapid development might mean sidelining of environmental concerns. Yes. And again, we will be advising ministers on ways in which they might pursue goals for economic growth that are directly and fundamentally integrated with growth for nature. So if we want to have a more joined up approach in the future, at Natural England we can see ways of doing that, whereby if you are going to plan new housing inside an investment zone, we will strongly be encouraging the planning for the flood defences in the form of new wetlands, the carbon capture in the form of new woodlands, the footpaths and recreation spaces that take people into these areas of restored nature, and to make those part and parcel of those very same investment zone decisions. Because what we really do not want is for this false idea that somehow we have to sacrifice nature to achieve economic growth to get any kind of recognition. It's completely wrong. If we do wish to have a sound economy and a healthy society into the future, then we have to restore nature, including in investment zones. So the third thing is the retained European Union law bill. This is the one that has been set out with great fanfare to be on the retirement of all European law. Thousands of European laws, hundreds of which at least are European environmental laws. Habitat Directive, Birds Directive, Water Framework Directive, Environmental Impact Directive, Strategic Environmental Impact Directive, all of these pieces of legislation which have shaped how we do things here now for some decades. Now, if government is committed to doing that, we are advising that then, if we're going to achieve our targets, which are stretching and good targets, then we're going to need to replace those laws with better laws, simply put. So if you're going to remove the European law, the critical environmental pieces of it need to be replaced with codes which are British, but which are going to be better. So that's our advice to government, and that's what we're doing. In terms of the reassurance you're seeking, I'm hoping you will hear all of that very soon from ministers.
So let's hope that government listens to you, Tony. Paul, do you want to add anything in relation to Epping Forest? Okay, Julie?
Yeah, I think it is really important, and it is really important to get joined up, because I mean that has really been around since John Loughton, since 2010, isn't it? I mean, it began then as a very major approach that little is something, but joined up is 1,000 times better. So I'm really enthusiastic. Carry on the great work, and that's where we need to get to.
Okay, Steve.
Yeah, can I just first of all say I've heard lots of speeches in this hall over the last 50 years, probably too many, but that was the most inspiring. So thank you very much. Really inspiring. My question is a very practical one and probably going to be answered by the more local people. You gave us a real vision for the future of our forest and how one way of protecting it is about expanding it. I really want to know how the Superintendent and us as a trust separately what kind of practical steps can we take to kind of work towards that vision?
Thank you, Councillor Murray. Very, very good question. And I think that the City Corporation have, for a number of years, tried to be ahead of this game through since 1959, acquiring buffer land around the forest, which to actually expand and protect the context and setting of the forest, but increasingly to use that land in ways that are more sustainable in terms of supporting the forest. If you go to Copt Hall, Open Day tomorrow, you'll see us opening a public consultation around how Copt Hall Estate might be converted to a more complementary habitat to the forest, while also protecting all its very important heritage designations as well. And I think there's an opportunity for us to look at our land in the buffer land, but also to reach out to others, which we've been trying to do through Green Arc. And we're the last active quadrant of Green Arc at the moment around London. And for those that are not aware, Green Arc was an attempt to try and revisit the original purposes of the Green Belt to provide public accessible and nature-rich green belt that's worthy of London, and our attempt still, we have some fantastic mapping now that understands the connections, the different land ownerships, and there are opportunities when funding allows to actually reach out. We think, talking to our colleagues at Lee Valley, if we can't join Epping Forest and Lee Valley, as Tony was mentioning earlier, then that's a really useful first step in trying to create a green arc across London, where we can rewild some wildlife and actually expand the capacity and the resilience of our two important habitats.
Yeah,
I agree.
Actually,
And
sorry,
I was just going to say, interestingly, in the Act for Lee Valley Park, there were what were called linear extensions which went into the forest. Now that isn't green arc, it included much land, but it was acknowledging the relevant significance of one piece of land and one land manager in Lee Valley Park, which has again staggeringly improved the landscape, and in Epping Forest.
Yeah, so it just reminded me, one thing I did forget to mention, which is also an upshot from the Environment Act last year, is the creation of a new spatial planning process called local nature recovery strategies. And so these are going to be critical for doing exactly what Paul just described in terms of how would you link up, work going on in the Lee Valley with what's going on in Epping Forest, with what's going on elsewhere. And those processes, again, this is 2023, we should see these coming through. They will be done at county level, so Essex will take this forward in this part of the world, and it's really going to be an opportunity for everyone to get involved and to be able to identify what we've got, i.e. the good places that are still there for nature, but then crucially which bits need to be repaired, restored and connected. And so there's an official process for this. And so I would have thought, Epping Forest Heritage Trust, City of London Corporation, working alongside Essex Wildlife Trust, plus the Natural England team will be involved with this. Getting people together in that discussion about how we can actually do this. Because, we've got all those things I described, all those targets, all those policies, and we've actually got a process to put it together. So that's incredibly exciting.
That's fantastic. It's fantastic to hear so much positivity about doing new things at a time when it feels quite defensive in many areas.
It is.
The gentleman at the back.
Thank you. Two quick questions. First is really how much of this is just redesignation, because lots of targets are achieved by redesignation. And the second one really for Paul is the city does a tremendous job, but you alluded to when funding allows, and it strikes many of us that the funding to do your job and the job of your staff is very restricted, and you can't do a lot of what you want to do, and how's that going to fit in?
So let's take Tony first on that.
Yeah.
On the redesignations and then Paul.
Yeah, so what we don't need is just to be renaming things and hoping that somehow that changes the outcomes. This is about having more, bigger, better connected in terms of the nature side, which means, just putting extra layers of protection or designation on what we've got. It's not going to do it. If we're going to have 30% protected by 2030, we're going to have more rather than changing the name of what we have. And so the National Nature Reserve declaration that could come here if people wanted it, I think, the sense of it wouldn't be to layer on yet more protection. The place is already protected. But what I would hope it would do would be an opportunity to redraw the boundary, a bigger boundary. So adding rather than changing the name of what we've got. And then which is what we've done on these two other supranational nature reserves I mentioned, the one in Dorset and the one in Somerset. It's an expansion rather than a renaming. And I think that would be, I had a brief conversation with Paul just as we were coming in the room, and I think that is the difference between an old approach to a national nature reserve compared to what we're now doing, which is about seeing them as the way in which we build that nature recovery network, as well as protecting existing wonderful assets. And so actually, just on that subject of designation and having more, we announced yesterday a notification of one of the largest lowland sites of special scientific interest yesterday in Cornwall, 3,000 hectares on the Penwith Moors, which is down towards Land's End, which wasn't the Triple SI on Thursday, but Friday it was. So we're not just renaming stuff, we're expanding it.
Thank you. Paul?
Thank you. I think it's a very interesting question, and I know Tony mentioned earlier Professor Loughton's barnstorming study about how we need to move the agenda forward, and I think he talked very actively about ending what has been called Doll's House conservation. The whole idea we have a little bit here, a little bit over there, and we just maintain and garden those little sites. The whole idea is to join these up and also to align our objectives. So it isn't just a redesignation or a new name, it's something about drawing partners together, aligning that activity so it benefits all the wildlife and gives the wildlife an opportunity to expand into areas exchanging wildlife. So it's a really, really useful scheme. I understand the question about funding. It's an ever-present issue for many conservation organisations. I think there's some huge opportunities coming our way. We're already preparing for biodiversity net gain, which again Tony mentioned earlier, which may well be legislation next year. And that gives us an opportunity to deal with developers and to take on their conservation objectives in our land or adjacent land. So there's some really interesting opportunities there. We're already working through a process as part of the Epping Forest SAC mitigation strategy, the special area conservation. We have 26,000 houses appearing quite close to the forest over the next 15-year local plan cycle, and we're going to be compensated by developers for the extra impact that will bring to the forest. That's package worth potentially £24 million over the next 15 years, where we'll be able to make improvements and changes to the forest and also expand our capacity to restore some landscapes, particularly in the bufferland, to potentially accept more visits and spread the load, but also to see wildlife thriving in a much wider area. So I think there are practical limits to what we can do with the city's funding, but I think we need to reach out and find other sources of funding to help us move forward.
Thank you, Paul. And we at the Trust absolutely stand with you and alongside you in partnership. If we can bring in extra resources to go along and match yours, then we're absolutely alongside you on that vision. The lady at the front here.
Yes, just about really the challenges and the opportunities of Epping Forest being in London, not just Essex. You know, the different London boroughs as well as the rest of the City of London. What are the challenges about that and the opportunities about that with all that administration and the tensions there?
Just a kind of broad thought about the opportunity for cooperation across local authority boundaries. There have been some interesting conversations I've had with other London boroughs around that kind of north bit of the conurbation about rewilding areas of farmland, which presently, you know, is pretty poor soil, it's not producing a lot of food, farmers there not necessarily wanting to carry on, and so some of that land coming back into, you know, potentially changing use and thinking about putting in more woodland, again adjacent to very high numbers of people who live nearby, and then again linking these across, you know, the ring around the entire city longer term would seem to be something that boroughs could cooperate on to some good effect. It's part of the nature recovery network again, and how we facilitate that. So opportunities for sure, practicalities are always more challenging.
Paul, do you want to have a word about you and Loughton Forest and Redbridge?
Yeah, I think it would, undoubtedly there are tensions because local plans are trying to deliver much needed houses in London for a growing population, and the household rate continues to expand, and the tension is we are a special area of conservation, and that development can be judged to be damaging, and we've had some useful European Court of Judgments which indicate that if you're going to mitigate for the or to manage the impact of new development around and its impact on the forest, there has to be a mechanism. There has to be a mechanism now to make sure that additional impact from pollution, air quality impacts, and recreational pressure isn't going to damage the forest more. And at the moment, some of the judgments coming from the local plans are that it's actually quite difficult to accommodate that new development and all the challenges it brings and the continued conservation of the forest. That's why we've developed this mitigation strategy, and it's been a fantastic piece of joint work with effectively 9 local authorities who all will have impacts on the special area of conservation. We've done a lot of research to establish what is known as a zone of influence around the special area of conservation that stretches out into various parts of London. I have to pay tribute, and I'm not just saying this because Tony's here, but Natural England have played a fantastic role as the honest broker in this process. They're one of the competent authorities, so they're very well placed. But they have been sharing our mitigation strategy, so no one local authority is seen to be lording it over the others. City Corporation not necessarily getting its way. So Natural England have a fantastic role in sharing this group, and has helped us move forward together with the focus on protecting the SAC. Still some work to do, particularly around air quality. We were already passive smoking London's pollution, which generally drifts from the southwest across the forest, and some of our SSSI units that are in not good or favourable condition. That's a direct response to atmospheric pollution. So we've got a way to go to fix that, and but I think all the local authorities are pointing in the same direction, and we do need, they do need their local plan approvals, so they've got to satisfy themselves as competent authorities they're not going to damage the SAC. They also need to satisfy Natural England that that case is another competent authority. So I think there's some really, really interesting opportunities to move forward. Yes, there is some tension, but some fantastic opportunities to come up with something. And I think it's been a really, really useful process, because by putting Epping Forest dead centre in the local plans, all the benefits that Tony was talking about that flow from having a forest area are being reflected in solid policies in all the local plans to protect the forest, to recognise the value that it provides to local residents. And I think that's a huge step forward to continue to reiterate that commitment in the local plans.
Yeah, I just, I'm trying to remember, but London's now the first forest city?
National Park City.
National Park City, that's the word.
Yeah, you're right. Actually, that's the same thought.
Yeah, I thought that's quite an interesting development.
It is.
Perhaps you could.
Yeah, I'm not a great expert, but there was a step taken a few years ago. A chap called Daniel Raven Ellison. He's a geographer. You can find some of his stuff if you look on the internet. But he was the instigator of London becoming the world's first national park city, which is speaking very much to all these themes we're picking up today. How do you blend in a high-quality green environment into a thriving city, and not just for the benefit of the nature, but for the people and the economy and everything else. So that step has been taken. Actually, I don't know, Paul, whether there's a vehicle there for some of this stuff, cross boroughs, I don't know, but one would hope so. One would hope it's added something to the conversation.
Yeah, they've recently reported a sort of action plan across the boroughs. So I mean, that's quite a positive step.
Yeah,
sure.
Very good.
Thank you all. Gentlemen at the front.
We've heard a lot of detail, and I'm not in any way denigrating that, because a lot of detail is needed. I'm just going to suggest that we have a concept in use in Britain which could be very good for a strategic overview for things like local nature recovery, and also for making it understandable to the wider public, and that is the concept of the biosphere reserve. We have 6 or 7 UNESCO biosphere reserves in Britain today, and the concept is really important in picking up, in using some of the ideas that you've been saying in terms of things like intensity of wildlife in certain areas and degrees of intensity of human use. And I'd like to see, in my imagination, I would like to see maps of those right across the country, a bit like these county plans, where those things are identified so that people can see the complexity of all these things mapped in front of them, and also see how they can move forward. And that spatial element, I think, is really important. So any further comments on making it explicable in that way?
I think that's one for Tony first.
Yeah, so two points there. I think one was about public communication and one was about mapping, and I guess trying to understand where the opportunities are to do better. On the public communication side, actually this was a subject that got into a green paper on nature recovery that was consulted upon earlier this year with ministers looking for ways in which we could get beyond these rather impenetrable acronyms of SAC, SSSOI, Ramsar sites and SACs and this, that and the other, and it is actually a real question in terms of how we can bring more people into the discussion by making it a little bit more transparent. Even the idea of Nature Recovery Network, which is our natural England way of trying to express something that most people can kind of get the gist of. I think even that some people think is a bit technical and a bit impenetrable. Our friends at the Wildlife Trusts have come up with this idea of wild belt. So green belt everyone gets. Does wild belt kind of have similar connotations? Anyway, people are thinking about all of that stuff. Never mind what you call it, however, how do you identify where to put it? And that mapping piece is critical. So I mentioned the local nature recovery strategies as a way in which you can target the resources that we've got, whether it's voluntary groups or government agencies or private sector investors. If you've got a map that tells you, in this place, sensible to do that, in this place, sensible to do the other, that's going to be really helpful. And actually, you've just reminded me of a piece of mapping work that I was shown a few months ago by the National Forest Company. So these are the people who are working between Leicestershire and Staffordshire. This started in the early 90s, I think, or late 80s, wasn't it, the National Forest? And it's quite a big area of old mining landscapes across the Midlands of England. And the idea was just to try and get more trees in it. And so the National Forest Company, they've gone from like 7% tree cover to 25% tree cover, something like that now, and they want to go to the next stage. And there's quite a lot of money coming in from different sources. And so, the question is, just do you put trees wherever you can, or do you try and make a case for those trees in particular places based upon mapping of the benefits you're trying to get? And so what they showed us was a series of layers in the map. And there's quite a lot of good reasons why you plant trees. So reason number one, which gets a lot of attention at the moment, is carbon. So across Leicestershire to Staffordshire, where's the best place to put a tree to catch carbon? Well, it's pretty much everywhere. So that kind of, that's fine. Second thing is, how can we plant trees to reduce flood risk? It's very interesting. So these areas, we've got cases of recent flooding as a result of this catchment losing its water all at once, and actually there's space for trees there. So you can say that's a good place to reduce flood risk. And then another thing you may say, where can we put trees to improve river water quality by catching sediments and protecting banks? And that gives you another map layer. You put all these on top of each other. And then another layer would be, where can we put trees for maximum benefit for wildlife? And on the map you may have two areas of ancient woodland separated by a bit of farmland, and you may say actually right there between those two is going to be the best biodiversity benefit. And then you may say, what's the best place to put it in terms of public health and well-being, and then proximity to towns and cities with access to cycling and walking routes. You put all these things on top of each other, and then you get these hotspots that come out, where you get carbon, water, flood risk, public health and nature all at once, right there. And so what that then does is you're levering a much bigger benefit from your public investment of grants to plant trees than you would do if you just scattered them all across the landscape. And so I think this mapping piece is critical if we're going to make the most of the opportunity that's down there. Meeting those targets for nature recovery. If we do this in an intelligent way, the bit of money we're spending, what the Forestry Commission is spending, what the City of London Corporation is investing, what the wildlife trusts are putting in, what Barrack Homes might spend, what Severn Trent Water will spend. If you've got a map template to say these are the zones of investment for these reasons, for this habitat, then I think you unleash a much bigger efficiency in terms of the public money and private money that's going in than if you just scatter it all over the place. And in the worst case scenario, have people arguing with each other over like, well, you can't plant your trees here because that's my chalk grassland, and then a big fight breaks out about whether marbled white butterflies are more important than lesser spotted woodpeckers. And of course, the answer is both are important.
Fantastic. I think we can move on from that's brilliant, Tony. And gentleman at the back's been working with on time.
Yeah, thank you. My question is probably best addressed to Paul Thomson. It's related to what we spoke about earlier about expanding the forest. But my question is about a very specific site, which is the Clays Lane former golf course, which has been just left for a number of years. It's a long time, I think, since any golf balls were hit there. And I believe it belongs to the City of London. It's right next to the forest. So does that have a future as part of expanding the forest or as bufferland? So that's my question. Thank you.
It's a very good question. Okay, so at Loughton Golf Course, one of the reasons it's been, we've been in dispute with our tenants for a number of years. That dispute was settled last year in court. It took an awful long time to settle that one. The city now has that land back, and sadly the tenants have lost their money, as it were, as a result of that court action. We're currently looking at different futures for the site, and certainly actively considering what we might do in terms of turning that land actually towards the forest. But right now we're also on an agenda to, going back to the earlier question, to raise more money. And seeing as though the site has largely been in active leisure pursuit in the Greenbelt for some time, we're in discussion with a number of groups about the future of the site. We'll be bringing something very shortly to committee about, I think, 4 possible futures for the site. But it does have the potential to offer us income that may outstrip the income we might receive through grants. So it's going to be quite a challenge for the trustees to make a decision about how we move that site forward.
That sounds like one for us to watch. Lady at the back, and then we'll move forward. Thank you.
Thank you, good morning, and thank you for your wonderful speech. I haven't heard the word education mentioned this morning. I'm just wondering to what extent education is on the agenda on both a local level and a national level to make sure that the kids, the young generation, have the respect that is needed to bring all this work and all this forward, basically.
Thank you. So the education side, yes, it's critical, isn't it? And the more we've gone along over the years, and I remember this very well in my Friends of the Earth days, how much are we putting in to equipping young people with knowledge about all these subjects, and for good reason, it was seen as absolutely vital, and we did put some resources there, but we always thought that actually this is going to be much more about the mainstream educational system rather than what a little environmental group could do working with teachers. And so there has been quite a lot of advocacy for more focus on this that actually led to a breakthrough quite recently. I don't know if you saw the Department for Education announcing that they're now going to start working on a natural history GCSE. This is the great work of a lady called Mary Colwell, environmentalist. Actually, you should have a look at that, and that will give you a little sense of what's in the offing there. And so Mary's idea of a natural history GCSE, she's rather like me in the sense of finished up doing this kind of work as a result of being a childhood naturalist. I mean, that's where most environmentalists of my generation, they were bird people, went looking for butterflies, and actually it wasn't part of the mainstream educational experience, really, far from it in those days. And it was really more a question of being a slightly feral child that ran wild in the woods, which then begs the question of having enough woods to do it. So the education is critical, but you have to have somewhere to take people for them to get those experiences in the first place. And so I think that wider connection with the natural environment is kind of a subset of the educational piece. But you're right, I mean, the educational side, it does need to come much more firmly into focus. And, that GCSE piece is a great step forward. Although, if my experience as a child is anything to go by, I would say that probably the formative years are really 4, 5, 6, 7. So long before you get to a GCSE in terms of having that passion and that affinity for nature, which then kind of becomes very lodged inside how people feel and think about these things. And the education system, of course, is about knowledge, whereas feeling and thinking is a slightly different thing, which I think comes more from exposure to actual nature rather than being told about it by someone who's kind of in a position as a teacher. But you know, we do have some calls for some hope of better things from that side. Actually, the Department for Education published a sustainability strategy earlier this year, and I think in there were, you know, thoughts about how you can repurpose some of these big expanses of green space that schools still have to turn them into, you know, part of the nature recovery network, right on the doorstep of where the children are, of course. And like, if you've got an educational establishment trying to teach people about nature, having some actual nature in the school, of course, would be an asset, wouldn't it? I've seen one or two lately, actually, that are actively building this in. A wonderful one in Dorset, in Poundbury, and kind of a lot of sustainability thinking going on there. But a state primary school, they basically got, you know, pretty substantial wetland with hides for looking at birds that the kids can use during normal school. They're growing a lot of their own food there, and you know, organic methods, so they can see pollinators and everything else. So, and actually, what they found, and a lot of other people have found this, is if you wish to get better educational outcomes, especially with children that face particular challenges like autism and attention disorders, putting them in the natural environment, it helps a lot. Actually, I mentioned that Penrith Moors SSSI that was notified yesterday, still to be confirmed, but I was there last week, just down near Land's End, and went out with the team, and we were just coming down from an Iron Age hill fort, which is right in the middle of it, talking of history and nature being right together. And we were coming down the hill, and a minibus had arrived there. It was a local school, and they brought out like 15 kids who go to a special school where they try and do education with autism being a really big deal. And they said, this is the most important facility we've got. And they use it pretty much every day. And so that kind of synergy between educational outcomes based upon access to nature, as well as telling kids about nature, you know, these two things, they go very well together, I think. But you have to have the nature. So the Nature Recovery Network, that's the whole point of it. Yeah.
And let me bring in Judith here, because that's your background, obviously, teaching.
Well, interestingly, in the now Epping Forest Heritage Trust, in its earlier days, and really up to about 2018, we took nursery kids out, you know, before they were actually in formal schools. And in fact, my first visit to the Centenary Trust then was little wee ones trying to climb over a log that's lying on the forest floor, which is just about the biggest invention you can actually imagine. And I think that was really important, and for various reasons and other priorities intervening, then they were merging, etc. That's only happened with two special groups that actually one came, the Magpie Project, lovely name, isn't it? And they actually had their own little pond and a sort of outdoor classroom, but it's for people which have recently come into the country. And well, we had just a wonderful time on the 3 sessions we had. And it's something we clearly hope to expand again. And we've been out with another group with refugee families. And again, it's just been often very familiar to them because they've lived perhaps in more rural areas in some cases. So, yeah, there's enormous scope to expand that.
Absolutely critical point, learning. I think it's worth mentioning again and again. Possibly even 3 times, but yeah, I think it's. We're pleased to play our part at Epping. We host Field Studies Council at High Beach, which continues to do a fantastic job in reaching out to schools. Heritage South does a fantastic job. We have London Borough of Waltham Forest right next door to High Beach as well, just rebranding themselves now to play an explicit role in talking to school children about climate change and climate action. So I don't think we can ever stop that discussion. And possibly a thoughtful piece, I fortunately worked for a while in America, but they have some fantastic land use mapping, I have to say. But also, one of the guys I work with, Professor Gus Spaeth, he set a really challenging thing for us as scientists, because our focus is very much on the things we talked about: biodiversity, collapse, climate change, and how we come up with a fairly technical response to managing those. And Gus was saying that actually these are all symptoms of a wider ill, and that actually what we need is spiritual renewal, because actually what's driving all these problems are apathy, selfishness and greed, and actually scientists are not particularly good at addressing those issues, but educators probably are. Can we do more to actually link our behaviour, which is sometimes often separate from the impacts on the environment, and actually try and join those things better together? I think that's a real challenge for us going forward.
That's a really important point. Thank you. So we've got about 10 minutes left, so questions quick and answers quick as well, please. Thanks.
Okay, thank you. This is addressed to Paul. I've been studying the local plan over a period of time as it's dragged on, and I can't quite see this positive message getting through to our local authorities. And I'd like to give an example. At the moment on the table is the proposal to demolish Loughton Library, which is 5-minute walking distance of the forest. And the mitigation is to pay money to monitor the air pollution in the forest. We have other planning applications to demolish on the table close to the forest too. I can't see how this will help the forest. Can you explain, please?
Okay, that's a challenging one. Yes, thank you. So I think we face a challenge that redeveloping brownfield sites is a key part of all the local plans in reducing the land take of new land that might otherwise, either be close to the forest or it might be a new farmland or whatever. So I think the city is an interesting place because we generally, historically, just have complained about all planning, and I think increasingly we're taking the view that we have to take a view that some planning is positive, and actually densification and reusing brownfield sites more effectively is probably a positive thing when that means there isn't new development closer to the forest on greenfield sites. So there's a challenge there about the mechanics. So each property or development will fund a per dwelling payment to the city to help compensate for the impact on the forest. And some of that impact is measurement, but some of it's more practical works on the forest in terms of improving habitats, some staff involved in directly interacting with the public, which we've seen particularly work well in Surrey Coast and Heath, the Hope Coast and Heath to the south of London. But yes, it's a challenging mix, and I think we're quite frustrated in some of the processing because I think we were compensation for development is mitigation is effectively a continuum. At one end it's compensation for damage done, at the other end it's the lovely things that Tony was talking about earlier, recovery, restoration, improving quite worn out land to create better habitats where nature will thrive. We've been trying to push developers down that road, but unfortunately a lot of the compensation payments are coming at the wrong end of the continuum, but we have to live with that process, but we continue to challenge people to do more. One of the things that's going on at Loughton Flats is that we hope to restore the old Lido site, which has been sitting there rather sadly at one sad corner of Loughton Flats, a triple SI compartment. And there's an opportunity now, using developers' money, to restore that whole site, to revive the wood pasture tradition on that site with hopefully some grazing. So, so I think there are, you have to look at it. I think my main message, you have to look at it as part of a bigger package. Yes, we are going to do some mitigation monitoring, but we will do mitigation works as well.
Thank you, Paul. I think we've got time for one more question at the front.
Hi, I'll just pick up on the air quality issue which has come up a couple of times. I was wondering if Tony in particular could say a bit more about sharing that shared nitrogen action plans he mentioned and who that involves and what the progress is. In particular, does it involve Highways Agency, given that we've got one motorway here that cuts through the forest, another one that runs very closely, and perhaps for Judy and Paul it's more an assessment of where we are on air pollution, the impact mitigation measures are happening, and the direction of travel on that.
Thank you. Yeah, so the Shared Nitrogen Action Plan, I've not been close to the detail of this, but from what I've seen in other parts of the country, I would expect it to be a multi-sector partnership trying to come together to work out what to do. So Highways Agency, local authority, Natural England, any other competent authorities that have a influence over the outcomes in terms of how much of that stuff's in the air. One I saw in Nottinghamshire was very much about farming, so ammonia coming from agriculture, from intensive pig and poultry, whereas here I would expect it's transport, isn't it? Yeah. So it would be much more about how you get the decision makers in those entities that you just mentioned. I think the local authority is particularly important in that conversation. I'm not sure we've actually decided that we will do one here. I think as a candidate, SNAP area, Shared Nitrogen Action Plan, but the local team will be able to tell you more about that. But like all of these things, you've often got multiple actors, and in the case of nitrogen in water, you've also got multiple sources, and so that shared bit of the action plan is critical. A lot of the parallel challenges we face on river water quality across the country, where we've got a statutory role in protecting SAC wetlands from damage from nutrients. You've got transport, you've got agriculture, and you've got wastewater coming from sewage works, and you put all three together, and it's like, well, who should take action? Well, the answer is all of them, and then you get into a conversation about how you can get down to the critical load and not exceeding that critical load. Which around here, and what Paul just said, is going to be pretty challenging because it's not even that local. Quite a lot of the pollution, it's coming southwest of the airstream, it's coming all the way from Heathrow as well, very likely. But hopefully we can make some progress by getting people together on that. And also, hopefully we can convince the public to play a part, because people being told they can't drive and have the convenience of being able to go where they want by car, of course, is also a big part of this. Technology can take us some way in terms of electrification and hybrids, but nonetheless, having the public with us is also very, very important. And when it comes to access, how do people get there? I think 90% of trips into the forest by car.
60% of our visitors come by car. We're very fortunate to have 12 railway stations around the forest.
Well, what can be made of those?
I think we are certainly promoting active travel as a way to help.
Anyway, any more local knowledge?
I think certainly we're in some very interesting discussions with local authorities. We're reviving our forest transport plan, which has made some major improvements around the road system in the forest, cattle grids, safe crossing points, reductions in speed. We now have 22 miles of roads around and in the forest and now subject to 40 or 30 or 20 mile an hour speed limits. So they're all practical improvements we can do. Some of the more difficult conversations, I would say, take Bell Common, which is an air quality management area, and which has some of the highest pollution levels in the forest, largely because traffic queue for long periods at that point. The solution is to give up forest land to provide a safe right turn and a filter going south. The debate we're having is how do we get that forest land back, and what sort of quality of land do we go back? And then the difficulty is, if you make it easier to drive through Bell Common, will more people use the road? So there's some really, really interesting modelling issues to discuss about our role in helping or facilitating reductions or possibly increases in pollution, and that's an interesting area of work. I don't have an instant answer for that, that's just the way it is.
So while I'm going to take chair's privilege and just ask one question to end from each of the panellists, which is one, in a single sentence, a reason to be positive about the future of the natural environment and Epping Forest at the moment.
I think people get it now, don't they? I think there's been a big change in the public mood over a few years, last couple of years in particular, the idea that we shouldn't have a healthy environment and shouldn't invest in it, I think that's an old idea. It's going. So I'm quite optimistic as a result of the change in the public mood. Yeah.
Paul?
I think I'd draw on our history. Lots of countries I've worked for have had creation myths about, you know, the values of the organisation from the founders. We have a reality myth, if you like. There is a story of almost 150 years of people fighting for the forest, and that desire to help the forest has never gone away. And I think you're all out there, you want to help, and I think we will find ways through these very new challenges that find a way to actually make the forest bigger and better than it was before.
Thank you. Judith, where?
And I think the other thing, I'll think of in a minute quickly. No, I think the other was the experience of COVID, which brought out a lot of the research, for instance, on how people value these green spaces. And if we thought they didn't, and there's still challenges and parking and so on, but I think it's really helped to raise the value of green space. And of course, that's the whole emphasis of Epping Forest, being a great big green space, stretching right the way into London.
That's fantastic.
Better.
So can we give the panellists a few